the equivalent of the last 10 years of tens of millions of pounds, have increased fares to 36% in just 6 years. And on top of that, are trying to basically do wage suppression. So if you look at the CPI's numbers, the CPI inflation, this is the Consumer Price Index, it's upwards of 7.5% over the last 12 years, and is projected to be about 10% over the next year. So the ask of the union of don't cut the transport by $4 billion and don't suppress our wages below the cost of living seems pretty reasonable. Well,
inflation, of course, doesn't stay where it is. I mean, it might be down to 2% in a year's time. So, I mean, if we start feeding increases in wages, as you will know, based solely on inflation, and we do that right across the board for teachers and nurses, then we would be in a terrible position economically.
That's not true. That's not necessarily true. The last time we had a cost of living crisis of this level was in the post-World War II era. So we're talking the 1950s. It was the last time it came even close to this level. And the way that they operated across the Anglo-American world, so we're talking America and Britain, wasn't to ensure higher profits for the already privileged, wasn't to do wage depression. It was, even in America, you had the top marginal tax rate at 91.5%. That's in America. And you saw the greatest sort of increases in wages. It was called the Golden Era, 1948 to 1968. And how did that happen? You taxed the people who had the most wealth, who were putting it in banks and in derivatives and putting it in financialization, not putting it back into the economy, and you gave it to working people.
So you give away other people's money. So other people work hard, take all the risk, and then you give it away. That's not going to work. That's called communism.
You're telling me the rail operators who get tens of millions in subsidies, who increase fares on a monopoly firm, which is rail lines, which are basically a monopoly, and made profits off of the public's dime, passed on those profits, 36 million to their shareholders. We're just talking in the rail lines in 2019. You're telling me that's hard-earned money. They were sitting in their PJs during COVID, while rail workers and teachers and nurses, the heroes who don't see wage increases now, were waking up at the crack of dawn during COVID and working.
I'm sure they would say they weren't in their PJs, but let's not try and speculate on their attire. Do you find it a little ironic, though, that the strikes are taking place after the government have effectively announced a renationalisation of the railways? The last time this happened, 1994, there was a set of 10 weeks' worth of stoppages, was almost in response to privatisation. And here we have another set of strikes at a time when the government are renationalising. That's curious.
Well, they've renationalized some of the rails, but lots of the rails haven't been. They're still in private hands. And yeah, I mean, the government is the one that's also instituting these cuts. So it's, it kind of depends whose hands it's in. I mean, maybe if there was a government that didn't believe in slashing and burning transport lines.
Well, Boris Johnson says more money, Ashok, is going into the economy into the railway economy than ever before. No government in history, I think I'm paraphrasing here, has put that amount of cash into the railways. I know you could argue he would say that, wouldn't he?
Boris is that he's pretty fast and loose with the facts. I'd like to see those. He's a little bit fast and loose, and I'm glad, there's at least some people in the media that push back, but not that often.
In terms of the mechanism of showing one's disquiet, the right to down tools and withdraw your labour, often seen as almost the most basic principle of workers' rights. And on paper, I do understand that. But, of course, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, that idea. There's other things to consider, like everyone else, for example, people getting to work, hospitals, waiting lists, teachers, doctors, nurses, people who use all sorts of other forms of our infrastructure. It's not a straightforward case of saying, well, look, they've got a gripe, so therefore they can hold the rest of the country to ransom, because that's exactly what's happening here, isn't it? And it's political.
Well, look, the people that are striking in certain sectors are the ones that win. The people who don't strike and the people who don't stand up for their rights don't win. That's the empirical evidence. Look at the history of the 20th century. Those sectors that are able to strike, that actually withdraw their labor, that actually make demands and hold them forward, we're talking 90% of workers in the sector voted to strike. It wasn't a small minority. And those who did that gained from it. The reason why rail workers have been able to keep decent wages and benefits while other sectors have been slashed and burned, in my sector, Our pensions have been cut. We've had a 20%, I'm a lecturer, 20% cut, real term cut over 12 years. We haven't been able to win. And when we make demands on our employers about cost of living crisis, because there's a real cost of living crisis, the fact that the rail workers are making those claims and making those demands and going on strike, they're not just doing it for themselves. They're doing it for all of us. I can have a greater ability to make that argument to my employer because they've done it. Rising tides raises all boats. This isn't a fight just for rail workers. It's actually a fight for all of us. So I think the tide has turned, actually. 10 years ago, when you didn't have a crisis like this, when when rail workers went on strike, there was a much more antagonistic and hostile environment. But right now, there's a clear cleavage between what the press and what the political class have to say and what most people feel. Most people are like, you know what? This is something that we all need to be fighting for.
So the only way to get your way is to cripple the rest of the economy. That, to me, I'm not purporting to know all the answers here, Ashok, but I sense that's probably not the best way to gain hearts and minds during a cost of living crisis.
The only way under the system that we live under for workers have ever been able to win. 160 years ago, people who own all the wealth now own slaves. Like, it's not like we have to sit around waiting for the beneficence and the benevolence of the people that own and are proprietors of capital. The fact is that workers, anytime, anywhere, like Frederick Douglass said in the 1800s, the only way that they've ever won is through a demand, and that demand has to be met with action.
But this is also it's a class war as well, Ashok, isn't it? This is about the wicked Tories, the filthy blues, the nasty old conservative scumbags.
You said it. I didn't say it.
It's all at cover. I can see the air bubble above your head behind that impressive bookshelf saying all of those things.
Well, look, I think that there's a clear antagonism between people who want to make the most money, and the way they can make most money is through wage suppression and cutting and flexibilizing, and workers who say, you know what, maybe 10 more billion in your bank account is less important than our ability to feed our families.
But do you not think that industrial action or strikers illuminate their cause somewhat when it's against the backdrop of a Tory government as distinct from a Labour one?
Well, not this Labour opposition. This Labour opposition is actually to the right of the Tory government. When it comes to minimum wage, they're making £10 demand, whereas you said Rishi Sunak is making a £10.50 demand. On corporation tax, 21 to 23% the Tory government. The Labour opposition is 19 to 20%.
That's why we need Jeremy Corbyn back, Ashok, isn't it? Along with Angela Rayner, the dream team.
You said it, not me.
The dream team of the economy. That'll get us off our backsides and get the economy working again, wouldn't it?
At least he stood for something. Keir Starmer is just Tory light. At least the Tories have some jokes.
All right, on that point, Ashok, thank you. At least they have some jokes. Ashok Kumar, Professor Political Economy, Birkbeck University, with us here on Talk TV.